Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here. We have a very good set of panel here to discuss the topic of food. And we hope that today's discussion will be as insightful as the other CIC discussions. Welcome, Ashok, Kurush, and Dr. Nandita. Let me invite Neena Kothari, Director of CIC, to welcome the panelists and start the session, please. Neena.
Thank you so much, Vanita. Thank you everyone for joining in. Food has always been and continues to be a very integral part of our culture and identity. The cuisine of South India is particularly unique on its own because of its different arc of history, climate, crops, and availability of spices. This 90-minute program seeks to explore South Indian cuisine in all its local diversity through the lens of nutrition, food science, and food archaeology and history. Our session this evening has three keynote addresses. The first, Archaeology and History of South Indian Food by Dr. Kurush Dalal. Welcome, Dr. Kurush Dalal. And he's an archaeologist, historian, food anthropologist, and raconteur, an assistant professor of the archaeology department at the University of Mumbai. He has a PhD from the Pune University and is a co-director of the Salkit Explorations Project, which documents the archaeology of Mumbai. Recently, he's taken a keen interest in researching culinary anthropology and food archaeology. Dr. Dalal owns KT's Kitchen, a beloved and popular Mumbai catering service specializing in ethnic Parsi food. Second is the South Indian Superfoods by Dr. Nandita Iyer. Welcome, Dr. Nandita. She is a medical doctor with a fellowship in applied nutrition. She is passionate about wellness, nutrition, writing, and music. Her blog, saffrontrail.com, on healthy vegetarian cooking is over 15 years old. Dr. Iyer is the author of two best-selling books, The Everyday Healthy Vegetarian and Everyday Superfoods, along with being a regular food columnist. The third talk is on The Science of South Indian Cooking by Krish Ashok, who is the TCS Global Head of Digital Workplace and the best-selling author of the book, The Masala Lab, The Science of Indian Cooking. The book explores the science of Indian cooking with the aim of making the reader a better cook and turning the kitchen into a joyful, creative playground for culinary experimentation. It uses simple first principles, middle school level science explanations, and hand-drawn illustrations to break down what happens and why it happens in the Indian kitchen, and recommends algorithms and meta models for the common dish types and regional Indian sub-cuisines. He is also a regular columnist on food, science, and culture for many prestigious publications. Ashok today will moderate and summarize the entire session, keeping time for questions towards the end. Welcome to Ashok, and over to you. We're really looking forward to this very exciting, delicious session this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Neena. Thank you, Vanita, for the generous introduction. I hope I'm audible clearly. So essentially, food is something that, as Neena says, defines us. It is part of our core identity, and we take food as identity rather seriously in this part of the world. We are often defined not just by what we eat, but by also what we choose not to eat. Sometimes we take it rather quite more seriously than we needed to, and so on. But at the same time, this is also a part of the world with such stunning culinary diversity. And particularly, given the fact that when you go outside India and say Indian food, what comes to people's minds is naan and kulcha, and chole bhature and dal makhani and butter chicken, and so on. largely again because of an accident of history. It's migrants from Punjab that moved outside India before a lot of other people and set up restaurants, and that came to be defined as Indian food around the world. It is changing. It is now idli and dosa are starting to become popular outside of India as well. But India is more than just butter chicken and idli and dosa. And in this session, it's a pleasure to have two of my favorite food experts with me here. And the way we've structured this session is we speak about the history, we speak about nutrition, and we speak about the science of specifically South Indian food. Now, if you're wondering, what is South Indian food? Is it what is the geographical boundaries of South Indian food? Right. So the answer to that question will vary depending on who you ask and at what point of time. The definition of South India right now is the 4 southern states, right? Defined as linguistic boundaries. People who speak Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, and Malayalam, but also several other more smaller, lesser-known languages like Badaga and Tulu and Konkani as well, also considered to be South Indians in that sense. But these are political definitions. The definition, if you go back 1,000 years, is anything south of the Vindhyas was essentially South India in that sense. So it's also important, therefore, to see that food does not have hard boundaries. People eat what they eat depending on where they live and what they get. And history often plays a critical role, and which is why we will start with history. And the second subject will be on the whole idea of nutrition and superfoods, right? What is our relationship with food? How do we treat and deal with the challenges of modernity, of the fact that we've been in a pandemic and we're ordering from Swiggy every other day, we're eating by ourselves, we're eating alone more often than not, and so on. And there's a ton of misinformation related to what is turmeric a superfood, or will drinking ginger cure COVID for me, and so on. So in that kind of a world, having a more sane and a scientifically grounded appreciation for how to think about nutrition and superfoods is essentially the second conversation. And finally, we will really end the conversation with the science of South Indian cooking. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Kurush to start with his talk, and I will ask him a few questions at the end. The audience, feel free to post your questions as and when you have them. And we will take up these questions at the end of the talks. So over to you, Dr. Kurush.
Thank you very much, Nina, Vanita, Krish, and Nandita. I am in very august company over here. So I'm the only guy who hasn't published a book, and therefore I'm not going to do a PPT. Okay, so everybody else is going to do PPTs apart from me. The main reason in my case is that I'll probably take over an hour and a half if I had to do that, because it's an enormously large period that I'll be talking about. The south of India is responsible for giving us some of the evidences of the earliest human occupation of the subcontinent. In Tamil Nadu, from a small site called Atrambakkam near Pundi, we have evidence of our ancestors being on the landscape as early as 1.51 million years ago. So the history of human populations in South India is really ancient. But the history of food as we understand it today actually sees its antecedents in something that we call the Neolithic period, which, depending on where you are in the world, starts roughly about 11 or 12,000 years ago and ends roughly about 3,000 years ago, give or take some years. Now, interestingly for us, the south of India did not see this shift from hunting-gathering of the Paleolithic period into the food production of the Neolithic period till very, very late. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. It tells us that the peoples of South India were incredibly self-reliant, self-sufficient, and didn't overexceed the carrying capacity of the land till very, very much later, when usually it's adverse climatic conditions and overexploitation of the landscape that forces you to start producing your own food. Now, the first myth that we start slaying when we talk about this is that the entire culinary tradition of southern India is therefore a tradition that is about, give or take, 100 years, 4,500 years old. So the earliest evidences that we have for food production in the 4, or well now 5 southern states, including Pondicherry, is something that goes back less than 2,500 BC. Now, this is quite startling to start off with because you have parts in northern India and in the Ganga Valley which are producing food as early as 9,000 years ago. So once again, it's not about coming late to the party. It's just about being self-sufficient and managing to carry on in a hunting-gathering way of life with a high dependence on protein and a low dependence on carbohydrates and fats in this earlier period. Okay, so from a hunting-gathering peoples, somewhere around 2,500 BC, we see the first agricultural or pastro-agricultural settlements in South India in what are called the Neolithic. The word that is used is ash mounds. So these sites are found next to large mounds of ash. And this ash is made up of burnt and semi-burnt cow dung or buffalo dung in enormous quantities. The earliest food producers in southern India were essentially pastoralists first and agriculturists second. So they had enormous pastoral flocks. And we have some fascinating sites in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and a few in Andhra Pradesh, though sadly, to the best of my knowledge, none in Kerala, because Kerala's climate, landscape, etc. has different requirements and therefore different answers to the situation. So from 4,500 years ago, we see people interacting with the north briefly in Maharashtra and in Madhya Pradesh, because there is some material that's coming south, but we see the complete lack of any metallurgy. We see stone tools being used, beautiful polished stone axes, and some of the most amazing blade tool traditions in the entire subcontinent are seen in the Neolithic traditions of southern India. We have some amazing sites at Halur, Sanganakallu, Tekalkota, and of course recent sites like Budhyal. And there is an enormous amount of data on these early Neolithic cattle keepers of southern India, as they're called. So their main diet was essentially meat and probably milk also. We can't discount the milk, though we have no direct evidence of the use of milk at all. So it was predominantly meat along with grain. So what you've got to understand about farming and the way we eat today is we eat the way we eat today because we had to grow our own food. Wherever we had to grow our own food, we were restricted to grow a food that could be grown once a year, with the monsoons helping us to grow it, which could be grown in abundance enough to stock, to consume throughout the year. And this food is essentially cereals. So we switched from a major protein-based diet in the Neolithic period all over the world into a major carbohydrate-based diet. Now in southern India, interestingly, they kept a large chunk of that protein-based diet by growing large crops of cattle. Yes, I'm saying crops of cattle because that was what the pastoralization was all about. And we have an enormous amount of evidence for butchering platforms and the consumption of meat, both beef and buffalo, during this period. We have beautiful inscriptions of rock engravings, bruisings, and rock paintings scattered all over the southern states, also cementing this understanding of this period. The number one cereal grown during this period was ragi, or what we call Elusina coracana, or nachni in the north, or finger millet, something that is still eaten to a large extent all over southern India. Southern India moved into the Iron Age quite early, and this is interesting. So we moved in the south of India into the Iron Age coevally with the rest of the country. Roughly by about 1200 to 1400 BC, the south of India moved into the early Iron Age, and we have the first evidences of the use of iron. Iron made life much easier. Iron tools made it easier for us to farm, for us to take care of cutting down forests, enlarging our fields, building our sheds, building more permanent structures, so on and so forth. We also see an abundance of trade throughout southern India during this period. And for the first time, we see a settled way of life in Kerala also, as we see the megalithic cultures, as they're called, expanding into these regions. These are essentially cultures which have left behind large amounts of mortuary data. So we have large cemeteries full of beautiful stone structures, either structures which are circles of large stones, which are called stone circles. We have beautiful topikalu and hat stones in Kerala. We have amazing dolomite cysts in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, and we have menhirs and others in Andhra Pradesh. These are all basically burial infrastructure, and in these burials, we get some beautiful evidence of the kind of food that was being eaten. And once again, the number one food that is being eaten is essentially ragi. The divisions between the far north of South India and the south of South India are also apparent from this period, at least as early as 3,000 years ago, when in North Karnataka we find flat dishes in all the burials, telling us that the ragi was essentially eaten in the form of flatbreads. Whereas everything being identical, in the south of Karnataka and into Tamil Nadu, the number one funerary pottery that we see, the funerary ceramics that we see, are bowls, telling us that it was porridges and mudde that were the number one way in which nachni was consumed in the south. So there was an enormous similarity between southern Karnataka and most of Tamil Nadu, and there were great similarities between northern Karnataka and parts of Andhra Pradesh. But the main cereal crop eaten in this entire region was essentially nachni. Yes, there was no rice. Rice only begins to appear in small quantities about 3,000 years ago in southern India, and this is only in small quantities. It was not a widely grown crop, it was not a widely eaten crop, and it was obviously a crop meant for very, very special occasions. Sometime around 400 BC, you see the downward movement of what we call the second urbanization. There are a number of very, very interesting sites. We have the port site of Pattanam, which goes back to at least 500 BC. We have a very interesting site going back to about 300 BC called Kizadi in Tamil Nadu, which is giving us some amazing evidences of the second urbanization, and which is very, very surely putting the Sangama era, or the earliest historical era, which is, well, the Sangama era for the south, for those who do not know, is, well, the Vedic era to the north. We are also seeing the movement of Brahmins and other upper castes from northern India into southern India during this period, and with them they're bringing their foods and they're bringing a lot of their food habits. The vegetarianism that is so predominant in South India is essentially predominant amongst the Brahmins and not amongst the other castes, and this is very, very evidently a difference between those coming from the north and those living in the south. They also bring a lot of vegetables with them. They bring a lot of other dals than those that have been eaten. So horse gram, peas, and masoor dal are known from the south. Sesame seeds are known from the south, and sesame oil was the number one oil as far as archaeology is concerned for the whole of peninsular India south of the Narmada. It was essentially sesame oil, which was the oil of choice, of course, along with ghee, as and when ghee was available. But you have to understand that for ghee to be available, you have to have milk, which has to be turned into butter, and then which has to be clarified into ghee, and it was an expensive commodity before the White Revolution. We have enormous contact in South India with cultures across the sea, and we have a lot of trade coming in at this point, and we have some of the first evidences for the use of spices. Mainly, these are peppercorns, both the round pepper and the long pepper, or piper longum and piper nigrum, are both used in southern India and are very, very much traditionally part of southern Indian cuisine, and they are autochthonous to southern India, as is ginger. Turmeric, ginger, pepper, these are the top three spices of southern India. Sesame oil is the number one oil in southern India, and nachni remains till very, very recently, till about 1,000 years ago, the number one grain all over southern India. The move from, or rather towards, more and more rice is part of an entire movement that takes place post the Pallava period, and it is from the Pallava Chalukya period as such, which is somewhere around the 6th, 7th century AD, that we first see the prominence of rice coming up, and we see this to a large extent because of major interactions from the south to the north. You have Pulakesin II attacking Harshavardhana. Harshavardhana and Pulakesin both claim to have defeated each other soundly. You have the Pallavas, of course, at Kanchipuram, and you have the rise of the most amazing art and architecture in Tamil Nadu. And of course, subsequently, you have the rise of the Cholas. And right from the Pallava period, you have an enormous amount of traffic going east. Now, Krish said something very interesting in the beginning when he said Indian food, when it's talked about abroad, is just very, very automatically, okay, very automatically, Indian food is naan, tandoori roti, tandoori chicken, butter chicken, so on and so forth. But when you go east and you talk about Indian food, and you go to Malaysia and you go to Sri Lanka, and you go to Singapore and you go to Hong Kong, it's essentially idli, dosa, and things like that, which are Indian food. So the most popular Indian restaurants all over Southeast Asia are South Indian restaurants. And the reason for this is that the South started moving nautically into this region. This is the Suvarnadvipa region. And the Indic stamp on the whole of Southeast Asia is absolutely and completely indelible. We know right from the Pallava period, we have inscriptions from Cambodia in, well, the very Pallava Grantha script, which was developed in South India so that they could write Sanskrit for Southern India. And well, Tamil doesn't quite allow the writing of Sanskrit in the form that it is, and so on and so forth. So we have the population and the populating of civilized Southeast Asia, which is again very much loaded and very much in inverted commas. And we have a lot of goods coming in from there. Pandan, cinnamon, cloves, so many of the spices, nutmeg, mace, that we understand are very, very common in the food that we eat, are actually coming to us between the 7th centuries and the 12th centuries AD, thanks to the massive trade that is taking place with Southeast Asia. On the other hand, our trade with the West is more of a trade of export and less of a trade of import, with the exception of gold, silver, and wine. So we have beautiful gold and silver coins of the Romans, as we don't really want Roman goods in exchange in the Indo-Roman period of roughly the 1st century, the 4th century AD. But we want gold and silver. We find it in beautiful burials all over Tamil Nadu and at excavation sites in Karnataka and on the coast on both sides and in Kerala. We also very, very interestingly have very, very clear identity of Indians moving into Sri Lanka as early as the 3rd century BC. We have continuous movement of trade. We have continuous movement of goods, and a large number of Sri Lankan foods also come across to India. Indian foods go into Sri Lanka, and the archaeology of this period becomes more and more interesting. Hing comes to India directly through the Persian trade, in the West Asian trade that is happening in this region. The parotta, as we call it, comes in directly from here also, since wheat is a completely alien crop to southern India, and it is essentially the Perso-Arabic peoples who are bringing these goods with them. So there is a continuous trade that is happening, and there are very, very interesting elements of food that are coming in. Bananas are being exported. Peppercorns are going out in vast quantities. We have the Mosiris papyrus, and we have evidence right from the furthest reaches of the Roman Empire, all the way along Hadrian's Wall. We know that pepper was being used by even common legionaries. It was that widely available. It was not cheap. It was expensive, but it was available even on Hadrian's Wall. And archaeologists know this because, well, the outside of peppercorns can't be digested by the human body, and we find the traces of the same in the septic tanks that we excavate of the Roman era. There are some very, very intriguing evidences of very early trade towards the west from Kerala and the Karnataka coast that we cannot account for even today. Ramesses II died in 1213 BC. Very precisely, we know this absolutely. There is no doubt in Egyptian chronology. Ramesses II's mummy had its nasal cavities filled with black peppercorns. But we have no evidence of anybody in a position to do this trade from Kerala at 1213 BC. So it is possibly from the other side, either from Karnataka or from Tamil Nadu, that this trade was actually going across by sea in this ridiculously early period. And the peppercorns growing by land are, well, virtually impossible to believe. We know the Greeks are sending ships. We know that the Egyptians are sending ships as early as 200 BC, but this is even 1,000 years before that. So the history of southern India is a history of spices. It's a history of ragi. It is then an overweening history of the imposition of rice as being primary in the diet. And it's something that's coming from the north to the south. And this is something that the south finds very difficult to accept. And archaeologists are like, but we're going by fact, right? So rice cultivation in the Bihar UP region is as early as 4,500 to 5,000 BC, if not earlier. The earliest rice cultivation that we know from southern India is only as recent as 1,000 BC. And that too, as I said, in really small quantities. So rice has its rise, Nachni sees its own fall. There is a very interesting caste-based equation over here too. We have the rise of vegetables. We have the rise of the Agrahara grants in the Chola period in the various Nadus. And we see the way in which Kerala and Karnataka restructure themselves in that same period. So the period between the 10th centuries AD and the 14th centuries AD are a very interesting feudal period in this region. And whilst everybody but the Brahmins are eating meat in decent quantities, if not large quantities, the Brahmins are becoming more and more vegetarian, and vegetarianism is being seen in Vaishnavite traditions as a better alternative or a more spiritual alternative. And this is also reflected to some extent in the archaeological record. Bananas, dals, sesame oil, spices, rice become the predominant factors in food in the south. Ginger is a very, very critically important spice, as is turmeric. Both are grown very, very locally from the earliest periods onwards. So in a nutshell, this is very simplistically the kind of food that is eaten in the south as understood through archaeology. The first evidences, literary evidences that archaeologists use for the vada and the sambar are spread between 300 years between the two. So there was actually vada in South India 300 years before there was the closest thing to sambar. And then there is the entire ludicrous argument about whether sambar came from Maharashtra, sambar came from Tanjore, sambar came from Tamil Nadu or not, which I think is a waste of time and space, but maybe Krish and Nandita will take that up from a historical perspective. As an archaeologist, I can't see sambar in the archaeological record anywhere. The use of tamarind, though, is there from a very early period. There are a lot of very interesting tribal elements, and some of these tribal elements, a lot of archaeologists believe, are the remnants of the original Neolithic peoples. Amongst them are the famous Todas of the Nilgiris, who are still cattle keepers even to this very day. So in the south, modernization and tradition exist and coexist side by side. And we see the rise of a Brahmanical vegetarian rice-eating culture, which superimposes itself on the ragi eating culture that is earlier. So in a nutshell, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the archaeology of food in southern India. There are multiple other factors, but going into that would be nitty-gritty splitting and a list of scientific names which would bore all of you all and me to tears.
So thank you, Dr. Kurush. That was stunning, as usual. I think, in 20 minutes, I just took down so many notes and, sort of like so dense in terms of today. I learned sort of a moment from the peppercorns in, Ramesses' nose and so on, to the fact that they might have been trained around that far back, clearly from, and it had to be South India because, the pepper doesn't grow anywhere else.
Doesn't grow anywhere else.
So I want to sort of, I just thought let me share one interesting factoid, and then I'm going to ask you a question, and then we'll get there. So the whole you spoke about Muziris, you spoke about Kiradi. All of these are obviously fascinating things with deep political implications as well, currently, unfortunately. But the interesting thing is that, yeah, so you think about, so apparently all of the spices had to go through, to get to the Roman Empire, they had to go through the port of Alexandria in Egypt, right? And apparently the port of Alexandria used to have this idea that some category of goods attracted customs duty and some goods did not, right? In fact, the root of the word spice is the same as the root of the word special and specific. So special items. So spice as in literally referred to a list of things that attracted customs duty. And I find it very funny that the one item that did not attract customs duty because the Romans imported it in such large volumes was pepper. Was that, strangely enough, pepper was not on that list of things that were considered to be spice from a purely customs duty standpoint. On that lighter note aside, I did want, since you mentioned Kiradi, I did want to kind of touch upon whether purely from a scientific, archaeological, whatever information we now know about the impact of cuisine in South India, as a result of the Indus Valley. I know there is now emerging evidence that it's very likely that the people of the Indus Valley may have spoken a Dravidian language. No, but the problem is we don't know whether they migrated down south or not. We know that their diet was largely very barley based. Not rice or wheat a little bit later, I guess, barley for the most part. And they were also very, very heavy meat eaters as well. So is there, do we, the answer could very well be that we don't know yet, but is there some kind of culinary connection between the end of the Indus Valley and then, the rise of
at this
culinary
point,
traditions that we know?
Zero.
Okay.
At this point, zero, because the earliest dates that we have for secure levels at Kizadi go back to 300 BC. We are hoping that there are a few levels underneath. So, you never get samples for all the levels that you want for. You can wish, but that's not happening. The gods play dirty and fast and loose. So we are hoping we'll get earlier dates and it would be very interesting. The earliest levels at Kizadi are not giving us very much data for urbanization, but they're giving us data for occupation of those levels. So what is very interesting is that the megalithic cultures appear to be in some cases urban and in most cases non-urban, which is a very fascinating world in its own right. Number two, we have no evidence of wheat farming or barley farming in southern India. I mean, these days is a different thing. So if the Harappans came down like the wolf on the fold, or with the Aryans and the wolf on the fold behind them, they would have definitely brought these grains with them. They didn't.
Yeah.
That in itself is a huge blow. The whole reason for Harappan spoke a Dravidian language is that there is a relict language called Brahui, which exists in that region, not even in the Harappan region, but actually in Balochistan. The word Dravidian is less than 200 years old. So, these are very political and linguistic arguments. And as an archaeologist, I will just tell you this, that there are 2,000 years between Kizadi and the Harappans. At the very least, there are 1,500 years.
Right.
So, this is a leap of faith at this point. We should be asking questions about what was the impact of the Neolithic cattle keepers on the Iron Age populations and of the Iron Age populations in their attempts at urbanization. Because there are a lot of other sites that we're looking at now, and we're looking at urbanization very differently from we've looked at it before. Also, South India has neglected its archaeology. I'll be very blunt. There is so much to do. And I know the few people who are working there working against all odds. So there are some amazing sites. There are definitely about 20 different Roman trading, Indo-Roman era, Indo-Roman era trading sites on the East Coast. Forget about the West Coast. We aren't doing enough. Buddhism comes down to Andhra Pradesh in the 3rd century BC for sure. We have some of the most amazing, we have the Bhattiprolu relics, which are lying like garbage in the Egmore Museum in Madras. Chennai. It's telling us that there is a change in the Brahmi script to accommodate specific tonal variations of southern India in the 3rd century BC. A lot of linguists feel that this is the beginning of, the linguistics of this region. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, Krish, The earliest known Tamil in the subcontinent which can be dated comes from southern India and not from northern India. So we have names, just names on pottery in burials.
Wow.
And these go back to at least the 5th century BC.
Wow, yes.
So,
Yes.
this is a very, very interesting period. We need a lot more work. See, one of the major roots that nobody talks about was, the entire Nabatean civilization happened because of the trade from South and West India and East India, okay, which was going via the sea routes, up the Red Sea, through the Sinai, through the Nabateans. Everybody taxed it on the way till it went to somewhere around Acre and those ports and shipped across the Med, to Europe.
Yep.
So the price of pepper by the time it got probably to Hadrian's Wall was about 100 times what it left Kerala.
Oh, yes.
And, a fortune could be made in a single ship.
Yes.
We have beautiful letters. There is an enormous wealth of data in Roman archives. But we would like to believe that we did everything first and we did it ourselves in India. And therefore, we don't need to see the history. So there.
So Dr. Kourosh, in the interest of time, so we could just keep talking about this all day. And I think, so what we'll do is that we'll get to the second session now, and then we'll come back with the questions. I did see some questions from the audience, which I will ask you at the end. All right.
Happily.
Thank you, Dr. Kourosh. All right. So we will get to the second session now. If you could come on. Yes, there you go. All right. So unmute your mic and maybe start sharing your screens while I introduce you. So we just had this fascinating talk about history, and so I'm going to now hand it over to Dr. Nandita for the talk on superfoods and South Indian superfoods specifically. Over to you.
Thanks, Ashok, and please let me know if I'm going beyond time.
Yes, I will let you know. I will appear on screen once you are at 20 minutes. That's what I will do.
Okay, that's good. Okay. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. That was, as always, a very fascinating talk by Kourosh, who's an old friend. And, his stories connecting food and archaeology are always fascinating, and as was the session. So today I'm going to talk about, of course, the topic is 11 actionable tips to superfoodize your everyday diet. Also because superfood is the kind of buzzword ever since the pandemic hit us last year. And I actually finished writing this book even before the pandemic hit us. So this was definitely not aimed at the pandemic, but as a way to improve our diet in our day-to-day life and using everyday ingredients, which is why the emphasis on everyday in my book title, and how you can use these foods which are local to you, which are easily available, which are not too expensive, and which are versatile, and include it in our everyday diet to improve our health and wellness and immunity, longevity, and all of that. So I will try and, this is pretty much all the content in my book, but I've tried to keep it, try to compress it and share with you in 15 minutes. So I hope you get some good information out of it. So the first tip here is, because it's all about actionable tips, it's going to be something that you can use in your everyday life. The first tip is to keep a food diary. So this is to understand what is your current relationship with food. And, we all tend to assume that we are eating healthy and we are eating in less quantities. And personally, when I started logging my food a few years ago, I realized that, something which I think it's just homemade, it's all healthy, I've personally cooked it, and, it will be, it will be, say, 300 calories. Turns out when I log it in, it's actually 600. And I'm not someone who wants to count all my calories every day, but this is just an indication to the fact that we always underestimate how much we are eating and what we are eating. Things like, because we are at home all day these days and we are working from home and the kids are at home, people constantly reach out for snacks, etc., which don't tend to come in our, in our mental calculation of what we are eating. So keeping a food diary really helps in tracking what are you eating on a day-to-day basis. So when you have a log of 3 or 4 days, you can get an overview as to, are you eating too much processed food? Are you eating enough protein? Are you ordering out too much? So this gives you a very good understanding and overview about your daily diet, which no nutritionist or expert needs to tell you. It just helps you understand what you're eating and drinking every day. Another very important aspect of a food diary is to keep a column which also tells you what's your state of mind when you're reaching out for a certain food. Are you bored? Are you angry? Are you stressed out about a deadline, etc.? So those emotional triggers are often responsible for the meals that we eat when it's not really meal time, and possibly you were just thirsty or bored. And it always helps to replace these when there's a certain emotional trigger and you eat a certain food, it's always good to replace this with a non-food reward, like say call your friend or watch like a 5-minute YouTube video. And trust me, that much of distraction is enough for you not to resort to food as as something to satisfy that particular trigger. Of course, there are lots of apps these days that you can download if you don't want to, write down in a book like is shown in the picture. You can, the useful thing about these apps is that it also helps you track your macros. Like it can tell you how much protein, did you eat enough protein for the day, or was your diet too much in carbs or fats? So at a glance with like a pie chart, it'll tell you how much you've been eating. So that's your first step. And when you have an agreement or you have a contract, you're expected to sign it. And this is because the cognitive neuroscience research has shown that when you write down something, it just adds to the commitment towards whatever you are pursuing. And which is why writing down with pen and paper or logging everything down, it just improves your commitment towards your good health and focusing on what you are eating. This is another very important point, because a lot of times you're all focusing on what we are eating and not really on how we are eating. So the picture I've used here is, a clip from a Korean series, which is totally around food, called Let's Eat. And, all the residents of this building often come together on their terrace and each one cooks a dish like a potluck, and they really, really, really enjoy that food. And, even as a viewer, you can get joy from just watching that. So there's this study done, about on the Japanese men living in US versus the Japanese men in Japan. And it was conducted with 4,000 people. And it showed that the Japanese men who live in Japan are far healthier than the ones who live in US. And they're also healthier than the Japanese men who eat Japanese traditional food in the US, which goes to show that there is something much more than what you are eating. It's the circumstances and it's how you eat your food. Like in Japan, eating is associated with its own rhythms and rituals. Things are very slow. Whereas the American way of life, things are much faster. There are drive-thrus, or like people just grab their meal and while walking on the street. And just simple things like that makes a huge difference, in the end result of how this food affects our body. And like there's this saying that eating salad in a hurry is not better than eating fish and chips, but sitting and relaxing with that and really enjoying that. So also pay attention to how you are eating, and try to eat slow, try to eat socially, and we'll come to that a little bit later in my talk. So this is something we've all heard, and we all know that processed food is bad, but it's all around us and it's convenient, and it's actually difficult to not fall for processed foods. And especially for children, they're continuously being targeted by ads. They see their friends eating it. So it just becomes a way of life. And hardly a day goes by in any of our lives when you don't open a packet and, remove something, be it snacks or anything, right? So the first rule in this is what you see is what you eat. So if you open your fridge and if you're going to see something packaged in front of you, that's the first thing. Or if in your kitchen at eye level, there's these packaged foods or snacks, that's the first thing you're going to reach out for. So I think that having something in front of your eyes and then trying not to eat it is like too much of a temptation, and it's going to be really difficult for us to cut down processed foods in our diet. So the best way to reduce the temptation, one, is to not get it at home. But if you have to get it at home for whatever reasons, that, it's for the others in your family, or you have to keep some things for your kids, at home, there's another way how you can reduce the temptation. It is to create the design of your house or your kitchen or your fridge in a way that you succeed in your goal of reducing processed foods. So there was a study done which showed that when you keep chocolate, in a place where you have to climb on a stool to get it, the consumption of chocolate in that house went down by 70%, 70. So it's insane that how just adding one obstacle between you and something you don't want to do reduces that chance by 70%. So including superfoods or making your food or making your diet healthier, all you need to do is reduce the obstacles between you and something good and increase the obstacle between you and something you don't want to do. So focus on designing your surroundings in a way that help you succeed. And also plan better, because I think most of us resort to processed foods when we don't have anything on hand and we feel like, okay, this is the fastest I can get, I'm very hungry. But when you plan, which is what we'll come to with the next slide, and when you're prepared for what you're going to eat for all your meals, there are lesser chances of you jumping for something that's available ready-made. So now that we've discussed, about logging your food, about paying attention to how you're eating your food, and also reducing processed foods in your diet, it's a good thing to know what must you include in your diet. And my book, Everyday Superfoods, has a list of 39 superfoods that are easily available in different parts of India. But since, our focus is on South Indian food, I'm going to pick out 3 or 4 very South Indian superfoods, which most of us probably already eat every day in our diet. But it's nice to know why, how does this help us? And, it helps us understand that why are we eating these foods. So the first thing I would like to mention here is black-eyed peas, or as it's called, karamani in Tamil. This is again considered like a very boring, it's not something fun. I think even things like rajma and chole are picked out more in comparison to black-eyed peas. But the great thing about black-eyed peas is folic acid, which is a very, very vital vitamin and antioxidant. You get almost 90% of your daily folic acid intake in just 1 cup of cooked black-eyed peas. And also 25% of the iron and protein intake for the day, 1/3 of the fiber. So these are just a few indications that tell you how important it is to include this in our everyday diet. It is very much a part of a traditional South Indian diet, but if you know how good it is for you, maybe you will choose it more often. The second, of course, is black pepper, and Korush spoke a lot about black pepper. It's got very good antioxidant properties, and the Tamil Nadu is one of the top 3 states. The other 2 are Kerala and Karnataka in producing black pepper. And it's like pepper rasam is chicken soup for the soul, and anytime one falls sick, it's something we reach out for. And it's just naturally something that we add to our diet when we are feeling a bit ill. It actually helps us by giving us more antioxidants that help us fight free radicals. The third thing is turmeric, of course, and we all know the whole world knows about its superfood impact right now. And in fact, any videos you watch made in US and Europe these days, food videos, they make sure that they add turmeric even to pasta, because they are just so obsessed with turmeric. Like turmeric latte is passe now, but I'm just adding turmeric to every savory dish. And it's also good to note how auspicious turmeric is considered, that it's harvested during the festival of Pongal and tied around the pot when the Pongal is made. And the top place in producing turmeric in India is actually Erode, one of the top places, Erode in Tamil Nadu. The relationship between turmeric and black pepper is a very important one. The active ingredient in turmeric is curcumin, and the one in black pepper, is piperine. And in the presence of black pepper, there's a 2000-fold better absorption of the active ingredient in turmeric. So it's like, gives like a booster in absorption of turmeric. So the thing to remember here is whenever you use turmeric in any dish, whether the recipe asks for it or not, go ahead and add some black pepper to it. So you will really get the benefit from the antioxidant potential of turmeric. And the other thing is that it also reduces the risk of cancer, because turmeric, the curcumin in turmeric is one of the compounds that reduces angiogenesis. That means it cuts down the blood supply to any budding tumors, and this is how it helps in cancer prevention. So I'll come to the fourth one now, which is tamarind, which also Kurush spoke about. And I think there's rarely any South Indian household that cooks traditional food and doesn't use tamarind in their everyday cooking. And tamarind trees stay for, like, they produce tamarind for 100 to 200 years, which is just so sustainable and organic in every possible way, because you don't really need to add any fertilizers or spray things on tamarind trees. They just give. And every part of the tamarind tree is used in native medicine for some ailment or the other. The very important thing about tamarind is it's excellent for diabetics or pre-diabetics, both type 1 and type 2, because it has this carbohydrate blocking effect, which makes me quite fascinated, because when we eat any tamarind-based curry with rice, it's like you are enjoying the rice, but again, tamarind exerts that kind of effect on the rice that you're not going to be absorbing all the carbohydrates. So that pairing is just like, it's so good. And it's also rich in magnesium, which reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes. And also the thiamine present in tamarind, it helps in using up the carbs more efficiently towards energy. So overall, in glucose metabolism and carbohydrate metabolism, tamarind plays a very important role. So when you eat your tamarind-based rasam or sambar or korambu with rice, you can, understand that it's having a very good beneficial effect when combined with rice. So I think I'll move on to the next slide, because then otherwise I'll be running short of time. If you do check out my book, you'll find the entire list of 39 superfoods, which is just an indication of all the kinds of very nutrient-rich foods that are already existing in Indian cuisine, and you can include that in your daily diet. So now that you know what the superfoods are, the next thing is to plan a menu for the week, and this is a part of being well planned, so that your dependence on processed foods and instant foods is much less. So just either you can just write in a notebook, or you get these kind of magnetic menu planners that you can stick on your fridge, and you can just write down roughly what you're going to make for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And at a glance, it'll tell you, if you're having enough protein, if you're using up all these superfoods. Like you have a superfood ready reckoner, and you make sure that you're including at least 2-3 of that in your daily diet, which is not difficult. So see, even things like tamarind, tomato, onion, garlic, pumpkin, there's so many ways in which you can use these in your daily diet. Greens. So just make sure that you have planned this out, and make sure you also take the inputs of your family members. So, everybody is on board with whatever is being cooked. The next thing is meal prep. So now once you've planned what you're going to cook for the week, and you've made sure that you're including a good amount of superfoods in your everyday diet, the next step is to meal prep, because it's physically impossible to cook 3 meals a day from scratch. And given that we're all working from home and there's a lot of added responsibility, and even people may think you are at home all day, but it's just not possible to cook from scratch. So in Indian families, we tend to use the freezer very less, and anything coming out of the fridge, there's always this, question mark, oh, nutrient loss, it's stale, it's not healthy enough. But trust me, it's definitely healthier than ordering from outside. So even if the nutrient loss was 2% in the fridge, which, a fridge is supposed to keep everything at that steady level and not deteriorate. And that's the function of the fridge. So might as well we use it to prep some interesting ingredients which take longer to cook. Things like brown rice, things like rajma or, chana, all these protein rich things, and make sure there's paneer stocked up, there's tofu. So, as long as you have all these, like pomegranate, it takes time to sit and peel one pomegranate to get a little bit for a salad. But if you already peeled 2-3 pomegranates and kept it in the fridge, you can just take a handful and make a salad anytime you want. So these are the ingredients that you should have prepped and kept it ready depending on your menu plan. And keep it, I'm not saying keep it for the whole week. Even if you keep it for 3 or 4 days, you can do it once again during the week. And choose a day like a Sunday or any day that your workload is less, to plan all this and cook certain things, which is easy to put together. Again, make sure that these help in your menu plan. So it's just easier to make those weekday meals. Choosing the right cookware. This is a subject of a lot of confusion these days, and people wonder, should I use non-stick? Should I use cast iron? And, even Instagram adds to the confusion. People are using all kinds of utensils and you wonder what's the right thing for me. And, aluminum cookware, though it was used quite a bit in India, but it does leach out some aluminum, which helps accelerate Alzheimer's and things like that. So you want to stay safe. You want to avoid aluminum cookware, obviously. Cast iron is good, but it requires some maintenance and it's quite heavy to lift. Even like a 9-inch pan can weigh 3 kilos and stuff. So it's not possible for everyone to use it. So the next best option is like stainless steel, which is also very durable, especially the tri-ply, and it's non-reactive with food. So, and of course, these are a bit more expensive. But when you choose cookware, it should also be something that will last generations and not something that you have to throw away every couple of years, because that's just adding to the waste that we are generating. Things like non-stick cookware, which even no matter how much money you throw on a non-stick, it's not going to last you more than 2 years. So make sure that you choose the right kind of cookware. And there's an interesting, fun fact in this regard, where in Europe, the pewter vessels were used to cook food, and when they used tomatoes in the dish, it made the lead leach out from the pewter and it poisoned people. So which was also one reason why they thought tomatoes were dangerous and they were poisonous, and they required a lot of convincing to include tomatoes in their diet. Okay, since Ashok has made an appearance, I will rush through the next few slides. So the next slide is all about superfood swaps. And, you eat whatever you eat in your everyday diet, idli, upma, dosas, or omelets, or rice. Just make sure you choose the better option. And that way it's easier to stick to your diet and not change it into something drastically different. But also make sure that you're including all these superfoods in your diet. There's this list from my book, but I'm sure you know what the good swaps are and you can make them. And with all this knowledge, you can create your own superfood recipes to use. When you make a swap, you already created your own recipe. So things like your everyday kanji mix, make sure there's a hearty serving of nuts and seeds, or a millet, or something sprouted, or green gram, etc. You can make your own rasam mix. Like I said, make sure there's pepper and turmeric, with your knowledge that these two act so well together. When you make salads, make sure there's a handful of pomegranate or chickpeas or rajma. So when you have that knowledge, you can create your own recipes that are, much, much more enriched with these kind of nutrient-rich foods. And see, these are the 5 superfoods. You can ask, like, this is so complicated. What am I supposed to eat every day? But if you just choose, make sure there's one thing from each of these 5 categories in your everyday diet. One is in the yellow and orange. There's tons of food. Start from mango, which is so available these days. Mango, pumpkin, yellow bell pepper, everything, right? Leafy greens is one category. Make sure there's something. Beans and lentils, we already have dal in some form every day, but make sure that you're consciously including it. Nuts and seeds, again, portion control, small handful and not like a big bowl of them, but make sure you include them. And something from the red and purple family. We have like eggplant, bell peppers, tomatoes, lots of red stuff. Don't just think about berries, blueberries, strawberries. There's so much other stuff that you can include every day. So these are, if you include something from each of these 5 groups every day, your diet overall should be great. Of course, also make sure the macros are in place, you're eating enough protein, etc. This is my last slide, Ashok, and after that I will wrap it up. To wrap up, I just want to tell you a few simple rules, because everything in nutrition comes across as so complicated, and people either say like complete extremes, right? Someone says, no, this is poison. Someone says that's like panacea. So you want to make sure that you follow certain simple rules which are easy in just to follow everyday life without getting confused by every bit of new information that keeps getting bombarded at you. Be moderate. You're never going to lose anything by being moderate. So eat a little less. Make sure you leave the party before it's over. So don't wait to eat like be feeling completely stuffed before you get up from the table. And for that, you have to eat slowly, because if you eat too fast, you will not know when you're getting full. It takes 20 minutes for the stomach to transmit information to your brain. So eat slow, eat socially. Of course, we're all socially distanced these days, but as soon as the pandemic gets over, please grab that opportunity with both hands. Have friends, family, make eating a joyous occasion and not like a guilt trip and all negative things associated with food. And eat a variety. So be more biodiverse. Don't order the same 5 things online every time. Eat a variety of foods. Be experimental. Don't stick to the same jaded combinations that I'll eat only sambar with this potato curry or something. Just be more diverse in your eating habits. And yeah, that concludes my presentation. I hope I was on time. Sorry if I took a few extra minutes. You can catch my book, Everyday Superfoods. It's on Amazon and Flipkart, etc. And also in bookstores if you're venturing out. My blog has a ton of like 800 plus recipes. It's a free resource. You can check it out. And I'm Saffron Trail on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I'm not very active. But there's this entire free salad series on Instagram, which you can check out. It's like a 14-part videos on every aspect of salad making, which you may find useful. So thanks CIC for this opportunity. And it's lovely to be in the company of 2 of my very old friends and, whom I love listening to. So this is a great chance for me to listen to them speak as well. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I might skip the question. So there are some questions for you. So you might want to click on the Q&A button while I'm talking,
Okay.
and then maybe answer some of those. And then we can take any pending questions at the end, I think.
Sure.
All right.
Sure.
So I am going to share my screen right now. And all right. Okay. So this has been a fascinating chat. So we started off with the archaeology and so many fascinating things that we learned, that rice came much later. We are such rice eating people in South India, and to know that no, rice came much later is indeed interesting. And I think so many other fascinating things we learned about the spice trade and how spices define South Indian food, and then how many of those spices, from ginger to turmeric to all of these, are also superfoods. How pepper actually interacts with curcumin and makes it more bioavailable, and so on is quite fascinating. So the last session is going to be on the science of South Indian food, all the way from idli to fish curry to biryani, right? And I'm actually going to start with a story that happened to a friend of mine, very lightweight story, and then and I'll tell you why I'm telling you this sort of slight funny story. So my friend went to Italy before the pandemic, and he coolly walked into a coffee shop, a beautiful coffee shop in Italy, and essentially asked for, as we all do, he said, "Get me one latte," right? And he expected to get this, but he actually got a glass of milk. And the reason he got a glass of milk is because, well, in Italian, latte just means milk. I mean, you have to say cafe latte. So the reason I often start with this is that in many situations, and we kind of saw this in Kurush's talk in terms of how you can only tell stories based on the archaeology that you have. And likewise, when we communicate anything, language and semantics and meaning are often important, and they change over time. Language becomes ambiguous over time. That's why a poem written in the 12th century, we sometimes don't know exactly what they're referring to, what those metaphors refer to, and so on. And so part of the reason that one of mankind's great inventions, if you will, is the scientific method, more so that the method itself is a precision in language. It's about being able to describe what you're doing in an unambiguous way over history, so that people can replicate what you're talking about. They can test it with experiments and so on. So that's the reason I started with this. And also, in some sense, why is food science important? Because one part of that entire this thing is just to improve communication about food. The precision that comes with using scientific language will ensure that the techniques and the history and the rich tradition that you have is something that can be passed on to the next generation without it being lost, right? So very briefly, what is food science? It's essentially the physics and chemistry and biology of what happens when flavor molecules in spices, the proteins and the carbohydrates and the fats interact with each other in a cooking pan or an oven or in a salad bowl at various proportions, temperatures, pH, and pressures. Right. So that's really what it is. It's absolutely essential for industrial food production. So if you're wondering, why do I need to understand food science to cook food at home? It's primarily, again, because one is that, and we've sort of heard this in Kurush's talk as well. One is that India's always had this oral tradition problem in that many things were not documented. Secondly, for the most part, home cooking, we have seemed to have outsourced to the women in our lives. And for till about a generation ago, we didn't really let them have an education either. So essentially, it means that a lot of the tacit knowledge that our grandmothers and mothers and their ancestors had is all tacit knowledge that they have gained by experimenting and trying things out in the kitchen and seeing what works, what does not work. It's all orally transmitted. Right? So we started writing things down very, very, very late. Okay, so that's why there are not too many cookbooks from India. You can barely name one or two, like the Manasolasa, which is also does not go into great detail either, right? And so on top of that, when we started documenting, we're only documenting them as recipes, and we're saying these are authentic recipes, these are not authentic recipes. And there's a huge misinformation universe. We just heard in the previous talk about how nutrition pseudoscience kind of get mixed with regular cooking ideas and so on. So the key thing is that grandmothers actually don't know food science, right? Or don't know the language of food science, but they know cooking. Okay? And that's the only knowledge that counts. Okay. So don't think just because you understand some science, you can go and lecture some people on, now I know exactly what happens when you do this, so you please do this and so on. So please don't do that, right? The intent of understanding science is so that you can communicate better, you can communicate more clearly, and you can verify stuff. So that's basically what it is. And science provides an unambiguous way to document the tacit knowledge of our grandmothers. Okay. So the second big element here is that if you think of food, we'll sort of very precisely talk about South Indian food here. If you think of food purely in terms of recipes, there's a problem that most recipes that you search on the internet, with few exceptions like Saffron Trail and so on, are mostly untested. Okay. Recipes are optimized, are search engine optimized. They're not optimized for accuracy. That's number one, right? Second thing is that recipes force you to think about food in a very limiting way. They force you to think that this is the only way to make it. And people actively go in search of an authentic recipe, whatever that means, right? So somehow this recipe that has this one ingredient, and by the way, it is written by someone who is from that place, and so therefore it is authentic, right? So, we kind of have these fallacies. But in reality, food and cooking evolves in everybody's kitchen every day. People change recipes, people cook with what they have, and change is continuous, right? So that's number one. Second thing is, the last thing obviously is that a lot of recipe writing is also replete with nutrition pseudoscience on top of that. So therefore, I want to introduce this idea of thinking about cooking as models and meta models. It's a recipe, a good recipe is a model, right? So you see that you're able to replicate exactly what that other person did, and hopefully, if it's written very well, you make the same thing, right? And so on. But, that's really not what cooking is about. But what recipes don't do is that they don't explain the why, right? Why does whatever happened in this thing, why do onions turn brown, right? Why does rice increase in size when you cook it? Why does starch become a certain texture when you steam it, right? Why does chicken get very dry when you overcook it, and so on? So these are very few recipes often explain the why, right? And the other larger problem is that home cooking is seen as an art. It's not. It's a craft, right? We see it as an art because we outsource it to the women in our lives who have to slave in the kitchen, 3 times a day. But at the end of the day, it's a craft because you have to do it 3 times a day. It is craft, and craft requires documentation, and documentation needs to be scientific. So that's the basic idea, right? So I'm sorry, I'm hearing my own, hold on a second. 1 second. Okay, hold on a second. Okay, sorry. I was hearing some sound, but I don't know if you guys can hear it. But so here's the point. Okay, so let me quickly talk about. Let's talk about an algorithm for sambar. So this is obviously it's a South Indian thing. So we're going to take the example of that, right? So rather than think of it as a recipe, I would rather that you think of it as having a base flavor and you add flavoring. Then you add an acid, which is usually tamarind, which is what adds sourness. Then you add some kind of dal, sometimes mostly tur dal, but sometimes moong dal as well. Then you add another layer of flavoring, could be more sambar powder, could be other spices as well. And then some kind of garnish like coriander leaves, curry leaves, and so on. And then a tempering at the end with oil or sesame oil or something like that to really uplift the flavor and so on. So when you think of it this way, you think of the whole recipe as a template, right? So you start with fat and spices and vegetables. You add a layer of flavoring. You add tamarind extract. You add mashed dal, and if you want vegetables and so on, right? So if you keep this in your mind, you can then derive a simple sambar recipe such as this, which is you start with oil, mustard, jeera, curry leaves, asafoetida. Then you add sambar powder, jaggery. Add the tamarind extract, mashed dal, coriander leaves, and this thing. But I could kind of do this in the sense of a restaurant sambar as well, right? So in a restaurant sambar, I need a little bit more layers of flavor. I use a special powder at the end, which is fenugreek, jeera, and dhania, to really elevate that flavor right at the end, and so on, right? So, or I could also do it in a arachivita sambar, which is that I make a paste as opposed to use sambar powder. So I take the spices along with coconut and make a paste, and then I add that instead, right? So my intent of this is to therefore say that I want to very briefly show you a video that I posted recently of something. If you're worried about authenticity, this might upset you. This is apple cider vinegar rasam. So basically the idea is that, look, a rasam is essentially an acidic sort of broth in which you add spices and herbs and so on. So it's a restorative sort of a soupy kind of a dish, right? So the broth can be anything. So the broth actually can be just water, which is what we use. The broth can be bone broth. It can be mutton broth or chicken broth or seafood broth as well, right? The acid usually is tamarind, but trust me, you can replace that acid with amchur, which is dry mango powder, or vinegar, right? And in this case, what I actually do, so I actually make the rasam powder. I'm just going to fast forward so you can see what's happening here. So I add apple cider vinegar, coriander stalk and so on, curry leaves and so. And then what I also do is that I add pulped apple. So you get the fruity, a little bit of the sweetness, and I use a sour green apple, right? And then apple cider vinegar. And this is apple cider vinegar rasam. And trust me, actually, it tastes very much like rasam. And it actually tastes really, really nice. So like pineapple rasam, you can actually make an apple cider vinegar rasam as well. So recipes are not holy cows, right? So at the end of the day, that's really my message here. So now kind of go to talking about, Dr. Kurush talked about the sense of the history of South Indian food, right? This broad region. So that far in the past, you can kind of broadly see, okay, these are the kinds of crops that were grown and so on. The political boundaries don't really matter. Okay. So in the modern context, I'm just simply going to say that let's define South Indian food, some characteristics of what differentiates styles of cooking and dishes in this part of the world. But there are a lot of commonalities. Let's not say as if this is some completely unique thing, but these are things that kind of, differentiate. One is that a lot of dishes here involve a lot more steaming and boiling than in cooking in North India, right? So I'm largely taking a very simplistic, I know it's a spectrum and so on. So if you take, say, cooking of, say, a place like Rajasthan, dry place, not too much water is used in cooking. People tend to deep fry things in ghee rather than actually steam it in water, because water is really precious and so on. So South India, historically, lots more water, tropical part of the world and so on. Second thing, obviously, is the elephant in the room, huge coastline. So very, very, very big on seafood. In fact, even as far inland as a place like Madurai, seafood is very, very popular, although it's not actually on the sea coast. Okay. In fact, the dish Jigardanda from Madurai, right, includes an ingredient that you get only in the sea, right? So marine algae is one of the ingredients in Jigardanda, right? So, and Madurai is nowhere close to the sea, so it clearly comes from the coast. So the coast is a very, very important aspect of South Indian cooking. The third element, again, in comparison with other parts of India, is the huge amount of lacto-fermentation. That's a daily part of all the things that happen that we cook, right? Fermentation is the most common fermentation all across India is fermenting milk into curd. Obviously, we have to preserve milk, so we ferment it. But in South India, our breakfast items, your idli and dosa and so on, are also products of lacto-fermentation. The fermentation of old rice, which you leave in the overnight, right? With a little bit of salt, and it will lacto-ferment. And then you add a little bit of onions, and you eat it, and it's fantastically nutritious the next day, and so on. So fermentation is far more prevalent. It kind of defines cooking in this part of the world. The other element is actually that South Indian food, on average, is hotter. Okay, so there are more spices. So it's funny, all the spices grow in South India or Southeast Asia. Garam masala is more heavily used in the North India. We actually use chilies. Chilies largely replace pepper, long pepper, and regular pepper in South Indian cooking as soon as the Portuguese arrived. And the food here is significantly hotter. Some hotter than others. Andhra is obviously hotter. And the chilies there are also hotter. You also get Kandari chilies from Kerala, which are really, really hot. Bird's eye chilies, if you will, right? And the other really fascinating thing, the current population of South India is far more lactose intolerant than North India. It is estimated that 70% of adults in North India are lactose tolerant. So the consumption of dairy products is several times. So the consumption of dairy products in the South is significantly lesser because most adults, only 30% of adults are estimated to be lactose tolerant. So the consumption of milk is much less. So the amount of milk that we use in things like tea is much smaller, right? So it's not very milky tea that we drink here and so on. So these are broad brush sort of characteristics. So with this in mind, I'm going to give you sort of three breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I'm going to take you through some of the most common myths and science tips that you need to do to up your game with these things. So let's start with breakfast, right? So obviously breakfast, idli, dosa, uttapam, and that entire family, appam, all of those things, all of those lacto-fermented dishes, right? So ultimately you have to understand that it's the bacteria on the surface of the urad dal and the rice to some extent, but it's usually very polished. So it's very little bacteria there. That's actually fermenting, causing the fermentation reaction to happen, right? So remember that when you ferment wheat to make bread, you normally add the active yeast separately, right? Although you could technically let wheat sit for a couple of days in water and it will turn into, the wild yeast will ferment, but it's very unpredictable. So there is a process called the whole sourdough starter process to actually get it under control and so on. But here, the bacteria on the surface of the urad dal is already there. There's 16 different kinds of bacteria and yeast. So interesting news is that your dosa or idli batter also has a tiny amount of alcohol, because when you have yeast, you always have alcohol. So when bacteria ferment, you get lactic acid, which is sour. So that's why your idli, mavu, dosa batter and all is sour, right? So now obviously we all know the method, you grind it separately because you want different textures. You add at least 2% salt and you let it ferment for anywhere between 6 to 18 hours, depending on where you live. Typically South India is warmer. So unless you're in Ooty, I don't think you'll need 18 hours, but in general. So wait for it. It will eventually happen. But although very delayed fermentation, you can get a lot of off flavors and so on, right? So the general theory is that day 1 of the batter, day 2 of the batter, you make idli, day 3 and 4 is suitable for dosa, and day 5 onwards, uttapam. Although, let me remind you that this is true for home. In restaurants, they make a separate batter directly for dosa, and it has a different proportion. They use a little bit more rice because you want it crisper and so on. So at home, you don't want to make 2-3 different kinds of batters, and this is what we do. Now, couple of science tips, right? So if you're worried about fermentation, you can always use yogurt. Why? Because it's the same bacteria that's fermenting milk into it's the same family of bacteria actually ferment your idli and dosa batter as well, right? So you can use yogurt as a backup inoculant to kickstart the process. The more rice you use, the more proportion of rice you use, the softer the idli. Now, there is a little bit of history to this as well. So historically, even right now, urad dal per gram is more expensive than rice. Rice is cheaper. So in generally, the richer people will eat idli and dosa with more urad dal because they can afford it and it's more protein. The poorer people will eat idli or dosa with more proportion of rice, right? And so if you take something like Kanchipuram idli, it's 1:1 rice to dal. Whereas the normal one that we make at home is anywhere from 3:1 to 4:1 ratio in terms of rice to urad dal, right? But the more rice you add, the softer the idli. You can also add things like poha, which to also make it softer. The other point is that the variety of rice. So in general, if you use a high amylose rice like Sona Masuri, you get a crisper dosa. Okay. But we tend to use high amylopectin punni or idli rice, as we call it, at least at home. We use it for both idli and dosa as well. But if you're wondering why your dosas are quite not as crisp as what the restaurant gets it, they use a different variety of rice. So that's the thing, right? So you need rice that is higher in a starch called amylopectin. So generally for idli, so it gets to be much softer. The other small little element, when you make the batter, after it's fermented, don't mix it. Then you lose air bubbles. Remember, this is a gluten-free batter. So there is no gluten to hold the carbon dioxide inside. So the moment you do this, you lose a lot of air bubbles and your idli will be slightly denser. Okay. So always just pour out even the little bit of the frothy, airy part directly into your idli, this thing, and you'll get the fluffiest, softest idlis. The first, in fact, the idlis made from just the top of the batter, just after fermentation, make the best kind of idlis, right? So this is one tip, right? And the other thing, right? So there is no hard rule that you have to use urad dal. Okay, you can use any dal and any grain. So you can replace the rice with any millet, and you can replace the dal. Particularly, I found that the soybean idli is actually fantastic. It is really healthy and really tasty. You can also use rajma or kidney beans. The color tends to be darker. You may not like it. But soybeans, you do the same thing that you would do with urad dal. Soak. You might have to soak for longer. And then you follow the exact same process. And you will get a fantastic idli, which is really, really high and very complete protein as well, right? So that's soybeans, right? And by the way, you can lacto-ferment anything. It's not just for idli and yogurt. You can lacto-ferment vegetables. Just put them in a 2% salt solution, and you can have a much healthier version of that vegetable because the bacteria would have broken down a lot of the nutrients into things that you can absorb far more easily, and they are pleasantly sour as well. Okay, so let's get to lunch. Okay, so lunch, I've picked, the quintessential gravy dish of all of South India. I've picked fish curry, which I think is very representative in terms of what people eat for lunch in South India, right? So first thing to remember, fish protein cooks at a very, very low temperature, right? And any temperature above this, you are overcooking the fish. Now, there's a good chance that you probably like the taste of overcooked fish. But trust me, if you have fish that is just cooked to around 60-65 Celsius, it will melt in your mouth and it is ridiculously easy to eat, right? And it is just fantastic. The texture is just amazing, right? So this is an important thing to remember, that you have to, if you're adding fish to your gravy, and especially if your gravy has tamarind or any other souring agent and so on, make sure that you've cooked it well enough at a high temperature so that then lower the temperature, only then add the fish. Because you do not want to overcook the fish at a temperature that is higher than 60 or 65 Celsius. And normally when anything is boiling, when you can visibly see it boiling, the temperature is well above 80 Celsius. That's, if you don't have a thermometer, that's the temperature. So the water should be nowhere, the gravy should be nowhere close to boiling. And this is a very important element. Okay. The other element is that you can really up your fish gravy game by making and storing seafood stock. So if you buy fish and you're cutting it and so on, or even if you don't, if you go tell your fish seller to give you all those bits, the head and the bits that you don't eat. Some people do eat, but if you don't eat the tail and many of those things, they will give it to you for free. All right. And if you are someone who peels the shrimp directly from the shell, store the shell, or ask the guy to give you shrimp shells. Okay. You can actually just boil them in water for about 90 minutes or so and make a fantastic seafood stock. It'll be so high in umami. And you just store it in your fridge. And when you're making fish curry, just also add this stock. And your fish curry will just taste 10x in terms of intensity and umami because the flavors will linger for much longer, right? So always also do this, right? And this is something that the Japanese and Southeast Asians do, and I think it's good to adapt that into South Indian cooking. The other element I've learned from Southeast Asian cooking is the use of anchovies, right? So it's very common to see dried anchovies, which we call karuvada in South India, to be used as a as something that you can where you can sort of you can dry the fish and you can use it as a quick protein snack any point of time. It is also exceedingly smelly and so on. But what I found is that using fresh anchovies that are in sort of in brine or oil at the start in your oil, and then you sort of just mix it up, right? Your ultimate dish will have such depth of flavor, and it will not be fishy at all. Okay, even if you don't like the smell of fish, right? It's a fantastic flavoring agent. You use mustard and curry leaves and so on. Just drop one anchovy in. It is just amazing. All right, so this is one. Likewise, if you're frying fish, for your lunch instead of having it as a gravy, and if you're using some kind of a batter, I know many people simply put turmeric and chili powder and just lightly fry the whole thing directly. But if you want a little bit of crispness, you need to have some kind of batter, like a fried fish of some kind. In that batter, instead of water, use soda. That will actually get you an ultra crisp batter, because the soda, the carbon dioxide, actually causes air bubbles, which makes your crisp surface even crisper because of the air gaps, air bubbles, and so on. And last but not the least, don't discard many of these crustacean shells, your crab and shrimp and so on, because if you have a home garden, you can just dry them, powder them, and then put it in your garden. And trust me, if you're growing vegetables, they'll be tastier. Okay? So the science behind that is that crustaceans are very similar to insects, and plants have defense mechanisms against insects. So they detect a molecule called chitin in the crustacean shells and defend against it. When a plant defends against insects, it becomes tastier, because the defense molecules is what we perceive as flavor, right? So this is lunch. And last but not the least, before we maybe get towards the end, is let's talk about dinner. So dinner, obviously, I'm going to talk about biryani, because it is the national dish of India, definitely the national dish of South India, clearly. Per capita consumption of biryani is insanely high, even within Tamil Nadu. I think it is the most ordered dish on all of the delivery apps, all over India, but particularly so in Tamil Nadu as well, right? So just a couple of broad tips. One is that brine your meat before marinating. Brining means that you need to put your chicken or mutton in salt water, which is 8% salt water, for at least an hour or two. If it's mutton, for slightly longer, but if it's chicken, for at least an hour before you marinate. And you don't need to marinate overnight. Marination in yogurt, you just need half an hour. Okay, so brining is what is important. That retains the juices in the meat. That will actually get you a much, much juicier meat when you actually make biryani. The other element is rather than add biryani masala powder, which at the end, or when you sort of, when you finish dum cooking and so on, consider actually taking those whole spices like cardamom, star anise, and cinnamon and so on, and then cooking them at low temperature in oil till all of the flavor actually goes. You can actually do this in ghee as well. So you get almost a biryani masala flavored ghee, right? And then just drizzle this oil on top of the biryani. In fact, you can drizzle it after you serve it to people on top of their tables. And they will think, oh, where on earth did all of this flavor come from? It came from this flavored ghee, right? Because it really locks in all those aromas, right? So consider using flavored oils, right? The second thing is, don't waste your time with basmati. Siraga Samba rice is significantly more superior to basmati in consistency. And you're far less likely to have a disaster of rice cooking with Siraga Samba. And it is as aromatic, and it's fantastic. It's smaller in size, but it's fantastic. So always, if you've never used Siraga Samba, use that variety of rice. And frying onions, make sure that the temperature is at 175. Any higher, your onion will burn. Any lower, it'll get greasy. So worthwhile getting a temperature check just for this to get your perfect crispy onions. Or by the way, if you have an air fryer, just drizzle some oil, drop it into an air fryer, and you can get pretty decent fried onions, actually, right? And last but not the least, when I eat biryani, what I hate most is biting into a star anise, biting into a cardamom, biting into a piece of cinnamon, and so on. Once you have actually cooked spices in oil, they don't have any flavor left. They're just flavorless husks. So consider using a small, veshti tuni or something, and putting all of these spices in, and then putting that into your biryani. You're not going to lose any flavor, right? So the restaurants leave it in because they need to prove to you that they have used expensive spices. Okay, they need to visually prove to you. But at home, please spare your people having to chew or spit out a piece of a cardamom, right? So I think that's... So on that note, go make some delicious South Indian food, apple cider vinegar rasam, and everything else. So on that note, if I can request our other speakers to come back on video so that we can quickly take some Q&A. So a couple of questions. I believe you've answered most of them, I think.
Yes, I have typed out answers to whatever
Okay.
was
So
said.
I think there are some.
Yeah.
Yes. So let's take a couple of questions that I think are interesting for everyone to hear, so that you can maybe. So I think there was one question to Kurush about the idea of breads and South India, and I think your answer was quite fascinating. Maybe if you could just briefly talk about it to everyone.
Well, I'm going to really get lynched and never be able to go south of Maharashtra again. But see, you've got to understand what breads are. What are breads? There are two main kinds of breads: leavened and unleavened. And we think there are only two ways to make bread. Either we bake it or we griddle it. Griddle cook it, right? Why don't we think of steaming? Why is steaming not a bread making process? All over the world, breads are steamed. Bagels are steamed, for example. Baos are steamed, for example. And there's no problem at all about them being breads. So we have a leavened steamed bread called the idli. Oh my God. What about ola dosa? What are they? They're essentially leavened, griddled and steamed breads, flat breads. Get out of that box that rice cannot make you bread. And understand this as something I think Krish was being very nice. The original idli was 100% urad dal.
Yes.
That is what Sangama literature says.
Yep.
100% urad dal. There was no rice in the idli. Rice is the way of making idli cheaper.
Yes.
Yeah, it does make it lighter, fluffier and all of that. I don't deny those bits. Okay. So as Nandita will tell you, if you switch to half and half rice and urad, that will be a far healthier idli than 100% rice idli. Am I wrong?
Yeah.
Very true.
And imagine if you put half ragi, half rice in that 50%. So 25-25 ragi rice and 50% urad. That's a power breakfast.
Absolutely.
So, we don't look at these things. We've got so carried away by the Brahmins do this and the Brahmins do it this way. Therefore, that's the best way to do it. But the Brahmins also make mistakes. They're not infallible. They were trying to do the best that they did with what they had. Don't ape them, no? I mean, they've moved beyond. The Brahmins are all moving back to ragi and health foods and things like that and eating quinoa in South India. And we've got everybody else trying to imitate them and eat rice and more rice.
That is true.
Blows my mind.
True. So, Nandita, one question that maybe I think would be important for you to tell others is this question on, this is common in the South to use tin-based vessels, although people think they're made of lead. So it's called Iyachumbu in Tamil. So does that actually, is there a health hazard there? And what do you think about the use of these tin-based vessels?
So see, traditionally, it has been used to make rasam. I think there's something to do with the shape and, that the fact that you don't want to boil the rasam, but just let it foam and then switch it off, etc. And there's this whole nostalgia and romanticism around this pot that it makes rasam taste better. Although I haven't, I'm sure Iyachumbu fans will come to lynch me, but I haven't really found any flavor difference, whether I make it in a stainless steel pan or Iyachumbu. But it is made out of tin alloys. Now, when you say alloy, it could be any other metal. And, when you don't buy it from a trusted source or like a certified company, there are chances that, people are just making alloys and lead. Some people do tend to add in lead, and then that could leach out and that could be dangerous. So I would never buy this from a source I don't trust. Or, there are these few companies. There's also this famous shop in Bangalore brand. It's also online, and they literally do this testing for heavy metal testing for every single utensil. So I would rather trust someone like that to buy and not just any source. And because they're also very expensive one, because of this whole current fascination with these traditional utensils. So definitely buy it from a trusted source. Or if it's something that's been used in your family for generations and it's come down to you and the chances of it being adulterated 60, 70 years ago would have been much less. Because right now it's being sold like a commodity, and chances are that it may be adulterated with lead. So just be
What about a
careful.
Kalla Chetty?
Pardon?
What about the
Stone.
Stone.
Kal Chettis?
Yeah, that's fairly harmless. But again, I don't know if the quality of stone and where it's, unearthed from matters. So I think the source matters. A lot of times you see them sold on highways and stuff like that. But if you're going to cook in those kind of terracotta pots and stuff, then definitely you want to make sure that some kind of pure raw materials are used, because that's something that's going into your food.
True, right.
All right.
And clay
So in
can
interest
be
of
so
time,
heavily adulterated.
Yeah.
Oh yes, yeah. So one thing that I did want to point out, there are lots of questions. There's somebody saying that, hey, I have eaten rasam made from this sort of tin vessel, and it definitely tastes more delicious and so on. It is a part of your experience of food is actually your nostalgia. So if you know the context, if you know it's being made in the Iyachobbu, it'll actually taste better. It's just how we are wired. In a blind taste test, you will not be able to distinguish between rasam made in a tin vessel.
I was just going to say that a blind taste test should be ordered immediately.
So always, But here's the point, right? In reality, our experience of food is not a blind taste test. It is the context of where we are, who is cooking for us, whether it's a loved one, and it's a lot of those things. So absolutely, I don't want to. So therefore, to dismiss the statement that rasam in this thing may not be true, but I think definitely it's important to understand that it is about this. So I did want to very briefly summarize. I want to thank Dr. Kurush and Dr. Nandita for their fantastic talks. And I think we went a little bit over time, but I think they've answered almost 22 questions. So hopefully, I think you got most of your questions answered. And I sort of want to quickly summarize by saying that, look, at the end of the day, the history of food in this part of the world is utterly fascinating and very counterintuitive. Many of the things that you take for granted or assume is ancient, it's tradition, we've been there for tens of thousands of years. At the end of the day, archaeology does not, have the evidence for most of that. Rice came much later. We are heavily millet consumers, and the habits, sometimes food habits change because of historical reasons. They change for colonialist reasons. The British clearly encouraged the consumption of rice and wheat over traditional millets. Bihar and Bengal started eating more rice and other things because the British didn't want them to grow millets, because they wanted them to grow opium. And so there's fascinating history behind every part of India and what we choose to eat and so on. And particularly this South India, if anything, there is still tremendous left to be unearthed is my key takeaway. There is just so much we don't know. We still don't know what the people at Kiredi ate and what the people before them ate and so on. We still haven't deciphered the script that they've written and so on. It is fascinating. And also the higher levels of protein that have historically been consumed in this part of the world is another thing that will come as a surprise to most people who think South Indians are mostly vegetarian. And I think the fascinating insights on building a better relationship with food, being able to understand where what you're eating comes from, understanding how it's being cooked, being involved in that process, eating with people, eating as well, and then sort of recording and to make a commitment to what you eat, and be aware of what is it that is locally available, that is naturally a superfood, a nutrition-rich, a micronutrient-rich superfood. All of this becomes an important thing to improve our relationship with food. And finally, we kind of spoke about, please stop thinking about authenticity and recipes. Just let yourself free. Think of food in terms of algorithms. Replace ingredients, right? You can swap any ingredient. You can use any acid. You can use any kind of fat. And you will get unique and new flavors. And what you make is as authentic as anyone else. On that note, I'll hand it over to Vanita.
Just before Vanita takes over, thank you very much, CIC. Thank you, Nandita. Always a pleasure. I'll hide all my ice cream at the bottom of the chest freezer. Thank you, Krish, for having me here also. And it's an absolute and total pleasure to do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kurush. I mean, thanks, first of all, Ashok, for putting this whole thing together, for proposing this topic. I think it was, very engaging, very informative. And like Kurush said in the beginning, it's, one of the most important topics that need discussion. And thanks, Nandita. I mean, I think your superfoods aspect was really good, very actionable takeaways for people to immediately start implementing food changes in life and lifestyle. So thanks so much everyone for being here with us. And as we speak, our next program has just got finalized. It's on July 23rd, prevention of brain aging. So we'll send the flyers to you and look forward to having you all back again soon. Thanks Ashok, Kurush and Nandita. Bye.
Thank you very much, Vanita.
Thank you
Pleasure.
very much. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you. Lovely seeing you all.